Doris's son Bob was sent on a secret military mission, and she fully believed that he would return home safely. But when two soldiers knocked on her door with a goodbye letter from Bob, Doris's world was turned upside down. She couldn't believe what she was reading and knew that she had to check for herself if the contents of the letter were true. So, with the help of her siblings, Doris dug up her son's grave in the dead of night, hoping to find the answers she needed. But what she found when she opened the coffin was something that she could never have imagined. When she looked into the coffin, she couldn't believe her eyes. "I knew it," she whispered, a triumphant look on her face. But what did Doris see when the coffin was opened? Bob had always known that he was destined to join the army. From a young age, he had dreamed of serving his country and being a role model for younger children. Despite her reservations, Doris initially held out hope that her son would eventually give up on his dream of joining the army. But as time went on, it became clear that Bob was more determined than ever to pursue a military career. Doris found it difficult to come to terms with her son's decision, but she knew that there was nothing she could do to stop him. She watched with a mix of pride and sadness as Bob left for military school, knowing that he was embarking on a new chapter in his life. It didn't take long for Bob to stand out at military school. He was already in excellent physical shape when he arrived, which helped him excel in all of his classes and training sessions. His natural talent and determination were clear to see, and it wasn't long before he caught the attention of his instructors. As the weeks and months passed, Bob continued to thrive. He was consistently at the top of his class, and he worked tirelessly to achieve his goals. And then something truly extraordinary happened. Bob became one of only a handful of people in the history of the military school to graduate early. It was an impressive feat, and one that was a testament to his hard work and dedication. Despite her initial reservations, Doris had come to be proud of her son's military career. However, as soon as Bob was promoted, he was deployed to the front lines. Doris couldn't help but worry about her son's safety, and she hoped that he would come home soon. As he prepared to leave for the front lines, Bob had to complete a number of required procedures, including writing a farewell letter. Bob was a member of the military, and as part of his job, he was required to follow orders without question. He was given a mission to undertake, but the details were kept secret, even from his own family. Bob and his team were not given any information about their destination before they left on their mission. This was done to maintain the highest level of secrecy and to prevent any potential espionage efforts from discovering their location. Bob and his team were blindfolded before they boarded the plane, further adding to the mystery and uncertainty of the situation. As a young corporal, Bob had never encountered such extreme measures before, and he couldn't help but wonder if there were spies operating at high levels within the organization, causing these extra precautions to be put in place. During the days following their departure, Bob and his team were exposed to a number of shocking and distressing experiences. They saw things that were so horrifying and unbelievable that they struggled to process what they were seeing. He and his team were confronted with situations and experiences that were beyond their comprehension, and they were forced to confront their own mortality in a way they had never done before. The horrors they saw left a deep and lasting impact on them, and they knew that they would never be the same after witnessing such atrocities. Despite his doubts and fears, Bob knew that he had to keep going, even if it meant facing unimaginable horrors. As the days went on, Bob found himself increasingly questioning his decision to undertake this mission. He began to regret ever leaving home and putting himself in this terrible situation. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had made a grave mistake, and he found himself consumed by doubts about his professional career and his future. The next day, Bob and his team were driving towards their base camp, looking forward to a well-deserved rest after completing their objective. They had been working non-stop for days, and they were exhausted and drained. As they drove, they heard a loud crash and felt the car come to an abrupt stop. It was only when they heard the sound of gunfire and shouting that they realized they were being ambushed. Bob and his team were caught completely off guard and had no time to prepare for the attack. He thought about his mother and all the things he wished he could have said to her, and he knew that he would never get the chance to tell her how much he loved her. With a final surge of effort, Bob tried to hold on, hoping against hope that he would make it through this terrible ordeal. But it was no use, and as the darkness consumed him, he knew that he was about to succumb to his injuries. A couple of days later, the doorbell rang at Bob's house. When Doris, Bob's mother, answered the door, she saw two military officers standing on the front porch. Their expressions were grave and serious, and Doris immediately knew what their visit meant. Doris's heart sank as she realized that her young son Bob was gone forever. One of the officers took out a letter and handed it to Doris. 3 days after Bob's death, the military held a funeral for the missing men. The funeral had been scheduled to take place 2 days after the event occurred, but it had been postponed for some reason. Doris found this strange, and she tried to contact the military to ask why the funeral had been postponed. Doris decided that she had to read her son's goodbye letter. She knew that it would be difficult to read, but she felt like she needed to know what Bob had wanted to say to her before he died. Doris was shocked and saddened as she read the final words written by her son. She had been expecting a heartfelt message or perhaps some final words of wisdom, but instead, the letter contained something that she could hardly believe. After reading her son's letter, Doris was devastated and completely lost faith in the military. She had always believed in the integrity and honor of the National Defense Force, but the contents of the letter had shattered that belief and left her feeling betrayed and disillusioned. Despite her grief and shock, Doris attended her son's funeral with her head held high, determined to show respect for the life he had lived and the sacrifices he had made. However, she couldn't shake the feeling of disbelief and disgust at the revelations contained in the letter, and she struggled to come to terms with the fact that such terrible things were happening within the military organization she had once held in such high regard. After the funeral was over and the guests had begun to disperse, Doris noticed that the two military officers who had been watching the edge during the service made no effort to approach her or offer their condolences. When the funeral was over, almost all the guests who had been present said goodbye to Doris. However, the woman noted that the two military officers who had been watching the edge did not make any contact with her. She wondered why this was, and if this had something to do with the fact that they might be hiding something. She called each of her siblings and asked them to meet with her the following afternoon, but she didn't give them many details over the phone, fearing that military equipment might be listening in on her conversations. The following day, Doris met with her two brothers and sister at her older brother's house, and she began to tell them everything about her son's final letter. As she spoke, her brothers were shocked and saddened by the revelations contained in the letter, and they asked to read it for themselves. The three of them were united in their determination to honor their brother's memory and to expose the truth, no matter what the cost. Finally, Doris brought up the idea that had been looming in the back of all of their minds. They would have to exhume her son's coffin in order to find out the truth. They agreed to go ahead with the plan, but they knew that they would have to be very careful and discreet in order to avoid attracting unwanted attention or causing a scandal. They decided to only dig at night when there was less likelihood of being seen or caught, and they planned to make it a one-night job in order to minimize the chances of getting caught. After 4 grueling hours of digging, Doris and her siblings finally heard the sound of their shovels hitting something solid. They knew that they had reached Bob's coffin, and Doris could see the lacquered wood of her son's coffin reflecting the light of the full moon. When the lid of the coffin was finally lifted, Doris couldn't believe what she saw. "I knew it," she said, her voice surprisingly calm despite the overwhelming emotions she was feeling. They couldn't believe what they were seeing, and they were filled with a sense of shock and confusion. How was this possible? They closed the lid again, knowing that they had to bury their brother a second time in order to protect his memory and to preserve the dignity of his final resting place. Making sure to leave no trace of their presence behind, she hurried to her office, determined to write down her findings and to share them with the world. After writing down all of her findings and the details of her son's final letter, she decided to print a copy of the newspaper with the whole story and to email it to a large newspaper company nearby, hoping that they would pick up the story and run it in their next edition. 2 days after Doris sent her story to the newspaper company, it was printed and spread throughout the city. Doris was both pleased and afraid of what would happen next, as she knew that exposing the truth would likely have serious consequences. Before she knew it, the military showed up at her door the same day, apparently wanting to welcome her and thank her for her bravery. 2 officers that Doris had never seen before took her to a military interrogation room. where they began to question her about the history that was happening in the city. She had sent the letter anonymously, so no one was officially sure that it was Doris who had tipped off the paper about the disturbing revelations contained in her son's final letter. She tried to stay calm and composed as the officers grilled her, knowing that the more information she gave them, the more at risk she would be. Therefore, Doris denied having any knowledge of the letter or the information contained within it, saying that she had no idea what the officers were talking about. She knew that she couldn't keep denying the truth forever, and she hoped that by showing the officers the letter, she could prove to them that she was telling the truth. She reached into her inside pocket and retrieved the letter that Bob had written to her, placing it on the table in front of the officers. The officers looked at each other in confusion, not sure what to make of this development. "Read it," Doris told them, hoping that the contents of the letter would convince them of her honesty and of the gravity of the situation. The officers read the letter several times, and after a while, they were too stunned to speak. "Ma'am, one of the officers began, but Doris cut him off, determined to make her point. "He will do everything in his power to bring my son back to the United States," she said firmly, hoping that the officers would understand the gravity of the situation and the importance of her request. After the questioning was over, Doris was sent home without much information or clarification about what would happen next. As she had already suspected, all she could do now was wait. One day, she suddenly received a letter from the military. She was told that they had located her son, but they were not sure if he was alive or not. Doris's entire body trembled with excitement and relief when she received the letter from the military. The anticipation was almost too much to bear when a black family car pulled up in front of her house, and Doris wondered if this could be the moment she had been waiting for. To Doris's complete surprise, as she watched the black car pull up to her house, she saw her son Bob get out of the car and start walking towards her front door. Her heart raced with excitement and happiness as she called out his name, and she hurried to the door to greet him. After they had hugged and cried and caught up for a few minutes, Doris and Bob sat down on the sofa together, and Bob began to tell her everything that had happened to him. He told her every detail of his experience, from the moment he was sent to the front lines to the day he was captured, and the moment he set foot in his homeland again. Doris listened with a mixture of horror and amazement as Bob told her about the torture and abuse he had suffered at the hands of his captors. He had been beaten and burned, but he had never given up hope and had always trusted that his mother would continue the search for him until she found him, dead or alive. Doris couldn't believe the strength and determination that her son had shown in the face of such adversity, and she was filled with pride and love for him.